Because at the end of the day, if everything is mediated through the media, there will be no change. And so we have to do more than words. We have to do more than speaking, and we have to do more than desiring to have a better world. We have to actually actively create it.
This is TrueNorthTV, powered by Communitech. From Waterloo Region in Ontario, Canada, to the world. The conversations you need and want to hear with interesting people on topics at the intersection of technology and humanity. Tech for good. Let's get started.
Well, thank you, Talia, and thank you all very much for joining us here. It's Tuesday at noon, and from the home office in Kitchener-Waterloo, this is TrueNorthTV. I wanted to thank you very much for joining us, and joining us with a very special guest today. Today we have the Chief of Police from Waterloo Region Police Services, Bryan Larkin, joining us. Welcome, Bryan.
It's great to be here and joining the team at TrueNorthTV and all of our friends at Communitech, and thank you for all your great work in our community. Happy to be here.
You know, the things we want to talk about today: community safety, policing during a pandemic, and how the tech community can help build a stronger, safer Waterloo Region. But you know, I was going to kick off with the COVID-19 and policing during that period of time, but of course, events in the last couple of weeks have really focused the public's attention on policing, and specifically policing of Black communities. Ryan, you and I are, you know, privileged white guys. We've never felt what it's like to be discriminated against. We've never known what it's like to be a Black person living in our community. Is there a message that you want to deliver?
You know, absolutely. I think that, you know, from the onset, I've never viewed myself as a typical police chief, and I don't really know what that means in many sense, but I would, you know, describe myself as very socially oriented. I have a very different approach to policing, and you know, internally, that has not always been, you know, favorably received on different policy pieces or issues. But I feel very strongly about the community that I live within. You know, I want to reaffirm that I recognize that, you know, clearly I'm a very privileged human being. I'm white, I'm a male, and I have had many stakeholders and many community leaders often pull me aside and say, you know, you need to use that privilege to make change. You need that privilege to challenge policy, to challenge procedures, and have courageous conversations. And I've always been committed to that. At times, not successfully. At times, you know, sort of concerned about managing all the different relationships internally, externally. But my message, you know, to the Police Services Board last week, and my message on going through all of this, in the last 6 years, I've been very much focused on making change within our police service, within our community. We're ready for the tough conversations. We're ready to listen. We're ready to make change. And I would suggest that we have been trying and working along this journey, but there's a lot more construction to be done. And that may include some remodeling, if I can use that analogy. I do think there's a greater future. I'm an eternal optimist by heart. I do believe that dialogue will bring us and lead us to common ground, and it will action change for the better for all citizens.
Tell me a bit about that journey over the last number of weeks as the head of police for Waterloo Region.
Certainly the last couple of weeks for our police service, for the policing profession in Ontario, nationally and globally, has been very challenging, although it's certainly an opportunity for us to look within our own organizations and to have larger dialogue. And so, you know, although it's been challenging, you know, my role as the Chief of Police is to ensure that we lead, and it's also to ensure that we listen and that we hear intently from our community. And what transpired in the United States, in particular the Minneapolis incident, is simply horrific. Watching the events unfold and watching that particular incident is very disheartening. it's saddening, and it brings about a number of different emotions, anger, frustration, asking myself as a police leader, how do we land here? And I recognize that, it's in a different country, but the reality is that it impacts all of us. And I've always been a firm believer that systemic racism, systemic discrimination, as well as systemic barriers exist within policing, as well as the broader context of our society. But my responsibility is policing. And so, I've been working very hard the last couple of weeks, in particular internally and with the Police Services Board. I do view this as an opportunity around reform. I view it as an opportunity for change. And it's been talking about policing. We've been talking about the economics of policing, but also talking about providing bias-neutral police services.
I mean, I think that there's many people who believe that this is an American issue, but of course we know that that there are policing issues right across Canada as well. What have you been doing to address these issues and concerns locally within the community? And I would say probably looking inside at what you do and how you do it, and looking outside at what more you could do to engage different communities.
Yeah, I don't view this as simply an American issue, and I recognize that in policing in Canada, although there's many differences than American policing, we do have national standards. We have a very different set of oversight and recruitment practices. But the reality is that, these issues and these challenges that we're hearing about are real. They occur in our community. They occur across Ontario and Canada. And so several years ago, with the support of the Police Services Board, I proposed the launch of an equity, inclusion, diversity unit. Prior to that, we did have an equity committee. We had a working group that looked at equality within the police service, as well as how do we build bridges externally within our organization. There was some subgroups and working towards, recruiting and recruiting strategies and some promotional and transfer processes, and really around how do we build a system that is egalitarian within the organization. Because I think sometimes you have to get your own house in order before you can actually perfect it or move towards excellence externally. And so we launched down this road of an equity, inclusion, diversity unit. It was also really the focus of humanizing our profession and humanizing the term, our badge in that sense. And so that was really the first piece. We engaged an external consultant to work with our service. We felt that it was very important to have an outside lens come into our organization and interview community members. And in March of this year, after an exhaustive process, we launched our first ever equity, inclusion, diversity plan, which was really meant to be the roadmap and the next sort of direction. And the plan was really built off of 5 strategies. It was essentially the key piece. There was sort of 5 key pillars that we're working towards. And the first one was total community engagement. One of the ones we've had a long-term relationship is with the Canadian Muslim Women Association, the Arab Women of Waterloo Region. We've had a couple of long-standing pieces, the Multicultural Society of Kitchener-Waterloo. The other piece was around developing a competent, very diverse workforce. And admittedly, it's been a challenge. We've done fairly well, and we've done much improved around our commitment to gender equity and gender-based recruitment and acquisition of talent, but we have struggled from a diverse perspective and a diverse lens. Third pillar around this was, again, that whole concept of talent management. And so when we welcome individuals into our workplace, they feel safe, they feel secure, they feel supported. And the last was, again, our last pillar about this is a secure and really supportive workplace for maximum member engagement. So look at some of the improvement and enhancements that we've made around women in policing. It's really been driven by our internal support networks. The concepts, the ideas, the leadership, the growth, the education, the training. Similarly, we've done a lot of amazing work with the LGBTQ+ community. This month as we celebrate Pride, all of our divisions are flying Pride flags. Our celebrations have been a bit different this year internally based on the pandemic. But again, very much driven from a safe, secure workplace. In 2004, we were the first police service in Ontario to launch a bias-neutral free procedure. And at the time, it was, sort of cutting edge. It was fairly new. Ontario was facing, some systemic reviews around racial profiling. I do think that there's opportunity for progress and change, but we have to do it in partnership with our community.
If I were to look forward from 30 years ago, I couldn't imagine the things that are happening in America are still happening in America. Do you think it's a function of the fact that the job of being an officer, a police officer, is significantly different than it was 30 or 50 years ago? I mean, cops are now asked to deal with issues around mental health and addiction and poverty, as opposed to routine law enforcement. Is it really time to, is the sort of incremental change in the path that we've taken in the past, is it enough, or do we need to really rethink the bundle as to what constitutes being a cop now, or net new models?
Yeah, it's great commentary and a great question, Ian, in the sense that, certainly policing's evolved in the last 50 years. I've only been in it for the last 30 years, and I have seen an evolution. I've seen it change. I think policing in many different ways, we're 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days of the year. And in many ways, we've become a catch-all, and we've become everything, and we're tried to be everything to everyone. And I firmly believe in, yourself as a business leader, when we try to be everything to everyone, you can't do everything extremely well. You may do a lot of things good, but you won't do a number of things great. And it's not to, I want to reaffirm, we have members that do amazing things every day in our community. They're caring, they're compassionate. The recruit and the individual that we bring into the organization now has never been more educated, has never been more technologically savvy. They've grown up in a different environment. So there's a lot of things that have really progressed positively. But we're also, when policing gets involved in some of the systemic issues that we're involved in and the system issues we're involved in, at many times the reality is that we're picking up the pieces of a system that is broken. And so when we're dealing with a person in crisis at 3 a.m, when we're dealing with the individual that doesn't have the luxury of having a home over their head in the middle of winter, when we're dealing with apprehending a child at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, trying to find the right supports and work with our partners at Family and Children's Services, for myself as a chief, I look at a number of these issues and go, okay, where did we miss? Where's the gaps in the system that could have prevented some of these issues? No different than, a death at the hands of the police is always a community tragedy. I look at all of the deaths, where police are involved in interactions as, how do we pause for a moment as a community and look at all the different interactions that we've had with this individual? Could we have done anything different? Could we have actually supported differently? Could we have had a different, more holistic wraparound approach? Generally speaking, if you were to overlay the education, the healthcare, the social services, the public health and policing system, we deal and we intervene with the same citizens and the same clients. And it's largely based around social determinants of health, poverty, housing, the economics of social disparity. And that's, also brings in the issues around, our Black community, our Indigenous community, people of color, who are from very much from a proportion, represented at high levels in our judicial system, high levels in interactions with policing, and I'll stay in the lane that I lead. But you can overlay those maps, and I think there's a different way to do business here. No different than the economics of policing. Clearly, I recognize that I have responsibilities to provide a safe community. People expect the police to do certain things, and I totally understand that. But at what point, when I look at the 3,500 calls, for example, a year, which are mental health based, and we are working very closely in partnership with the CMHA and the Impact Program with a mental health nurse that has done amazing things since we launched it, there's likely a better response that actually navigates the patient, the citizen, the client in a better outcome. I think I know you've seen me talk about this, Ian. I don't believe the judicial system is the cure-all for all of the issues that we face within policing. I think the mental health court, the drug court are all excellent approaches, but they're very limited because they're not funded appropriately. And so we need to, I view the concept of really refunding. When you look at some of the mental health challenges we're facing in our community, they're largely tied to government and policy decisions dating back to the 1990s. And they've manifested themselves in some significant issues. I think that this is an opportunity for us as community leaders. My commitment as a chief in Ontario is I've been having these discussions around what does it look like differently. We can't be everything to everyone, and we can't actually own all of the challenges that arise. And there has to be a different approach. I get it. We're 365. I also understand that we have, a communication center, but we can navigate and we can reroute. In 1991, when I started, we were still issuing parking tickets overnight. We don't do that anymore. Somebody else does that. There's many, many different ways to do policing and to provide a service which is modernized and different. And so that's where I think that the dialogue and the discussion really needs to go with all levels of government is let's reimagine what we potentially can be. And let's get back to the basics of focusing on what our role should be. When you look at violent crime and organized crime, and you look at economic crime and cyber crime, it's a whole new world. We're responsible for policing two communities. The traditional neighborhood that all of us like to refer to as home, and we want it to be safe. I believe that there's not one community in our region that doesn't want a safe community and to feel safe. The second piece is our online community, our cyber world. That requires policing and it requires law enforcement as well.
I think it's time, and I think what a lot of the sentiment is out there is that it is time to do something substantive. You use the word reform. I think that people are sort of, to some extent, mad as hell, not going to take it anymore. And when you think about reform, what are the models that you think we should examine? I know everyone talks about Camden, New Jersey, but are there other communities that we should be looking at as a way as a starting point? I
think, the term reform or transformation, those always mean different things to different individuals. But our service, I think back to, I worked on a project in 2004 where we, looked at promising practices across the globe. And every year the Canadian chiefs pulled together a cross-section of police leaders from across Canada to participate in global studies. And we've looked at authentic inclusion. We've looked at trust in policing. Last year, we also looked at something I'm very passionate about, and that is really the diversion of simple possession drug charges, that, we should be moving towards a public health model and not criminalizing addiction and mental health and some of those pieces. But I think overall, Iain, that's a broader discussion. I think that when we look at what's happening, again, I do want to, support the model in Ontario. Ontario is one of the first provinces to have oversight, to have an independent investigative body. Had, use of force reporting. Like, they were fairly progressed in the 1990s. And that was the new Police Services Act that was really actually rebuilt and redone in 1990. The current government has the Comprehensive Police Services Act, which is in phases being launched into law. And I think the next phase will be in January of 2020 or somewhere around there, that is very much built on adequacy and regulations. But I think that this is an opportunity to really look at how do we integrate. So for myself as a chief, I've always viewed, policing should really, and I'll date myself on this one, but I've always viewed policing should be very much sort of like the cartoon Scooby-Doo with the mystery machine, where, 5 individuals jumped out and all had different skill sets and could provide service and solve something collectively, but all have different pieces. And so, I think when we send a highly trained police officer to a mental health call for service, when you have 1,200 employees, the skill set varies. And so how do we equip the right people at the right time with the right partners to respond? So I look at the work that we're doing in child youth advocacy, where we investigate the exploitation and allegations of sexual assault involving young people. It's a horrific, violent crime that if we don't get it right, we know that the victim and the survivor of that crime is impacted for life. And so when we look at our approach in Waterloo Region, where we pair up a child youth advocate, a social worker with an investigator to bring a holistic approach to the investigation, I think the outcome is much better. One is that we see process, we see the actual judicial system, and I think most citizens would agree that those should be investigated and they should be processed through our court system and our judicial system. But also through this is that the victim, the survivor, has support, somebody that's empathetic, caring for them. So naturally, the question is, well, why can't we apply that to adult victims and survivors? When we look at the Impact program, which has a mental health nurse that, is paired up with a police officer, we know and we've seen in the last 2 years, our apprehension rates go down. The amount of time that we spend in a hospital room waiting for emergency care goes down, which takes pressures off the system. So I think that, there's lots of different ways to reimagine and re-envision this. I think we have to have a larger discussion is what's our core responsibilities? What does the community want us doing? I'm a big believer in technology. And when you look at the amount of resources and the number of calls that I get for example, traffic enforcement, we have technology that can do this for us. And not every encounter replaces a roadside encounter with a police officer or somebody enforcing the law. But the reality is that, we've seen the decline in significant serious collisions at red light intersections where red light cameras are installed. Whether you love them or dislike them, roundabouts have made a change in reducing the severity of serious collisions. These are all applications of technology that changed policing. And so we should look at other systems and other social pieces. I look at the work we're doing, for example, in Kitchener with the Working Center and House of Friendship and our outreach workers. Policing is not the primary responder. In fact, we built a system where our outreach workers are the primary responder. And they bring a level of skill, they bring a level of empathy, and they also can navigate the system very differently that doesn't require police response. So I think that there's examples of these pieces that, let's have a larger piece, even around cybercrime. Do we need somebody that has police authority under legislation to be online investigating some of these occurrences, or can we do business differently?
I want to shift gears a bit. I want to talk a bit about COVID and the pandemic and how it's changed things and how it's affected police and what are you seeing and doing on the job? Have officers' lives changed? Are calls up or down? We see reports about people doing all kinds of crazy stunt driving and speeding. What's happened from the sort of boots on the ground from the people who are out there frontline service in what they're saying in shifts in crime and activity?
2020 has been a really interesting year, and I'm sure many people use that term, it's an interesting year or it's challenging. But in reality, I think of the seat that I sit in, there is really no how-to book for the chief of police. We had a pandemic procedure that was really built off of SARS and H1N1. But we've never seen anything such as COVID-19. And so, I think back to, for us, I think it's been around 15 weeks that we've been involved in sort of the pandemic world. For us, it was right before St. Patrick's Day. And so we were planning for, obviously, Uptown Waterloo, some significant masses of young people celebrating St. Patrick's Day. And on March 17th, the province issued a state of emergency. I had been involved in and engaged in some dialogue with the Solicitor General in relation to St. Patrick's Day and the crowds and the pandemic. But that was a game changer for us organizationally. It gave us, maybe we had about 12 hours of pre-planning. We went into action. And one of the things that I'm most proud about around policing is the resilience and the ability for our members to adapt. And, you know, you talked about this earlier, is that we have really well-intended people that want to make a difference in the community. And so the pandemic piece, you know, we launched an emergency control center, which was the first time we've ever really launched an operations center. They managed all things pandemic. In reality, to give you an example or some insight, chiefs of police on any given day, along with the Police Services Board, we were getting anywhere from 20 to 25 directions from the province of things that we had to implement, things that we had to do, working very closely with public health. The region of Waterloo launched a pandemic control group. But I'm very, you know, proud of our community. Essentially, people did go down into lockdown. Our employees went into lockdown. And so from a call demand, probably the first 10 weeks of the pandemic, our call demand was down, you know, 8 to 10%. We saw a decline in home break-and-enters, residential break-and-enters, because people were home. We saw a decline in vehicle thefts because there was less vehicles on our roadways. You know, overall, you know, we really saw this significant impact on crime. In fact, our strategic services team is working with several universities around the impact of pandemic had on crime in our community in Ontario. But the flip side of that is that we also saw those people that were still working or involved on our roadways. We saw a whole push on road safety. The amount of stunt driving and the amount of people exceeding the speed limit was significant. And I'm sure that there's a whole human behavior study that could be done there around less vehicles on the roadway. I feel more safe in my driving habits. But our members, you know, we're launching a whole different approach, you know, and equally, you know, I guess the old adage of every crisis creates an opportunity, you know, never let a crisis go to waste. We capitalized on that. You know, for many years, we looked at work-life balance in an organization. You know, we're an institution, we're an extension of government. People come to work, they have offices, they have cubicles. I mean, that's been the way we've set up. Personally, as the chief, I've been long around trying to create an atmosphere similar to some of our tech companies where it's more open, it's more creative, it's more innovative, trying to create incubation hubs. And, you know, I've always been told, well, we can't work from home. It will never happen. And within a short period of time, we were able to get 15% of our workforce working from home, doing amazing work. Naturally, our members that provide frontline services were coming to work, serving 24/7. You know, but we had a plan in place around personal protection equipment and all those pieces. Is it perfect? Not perfect. We learned a lot of lessons. We were involved in calls with our Greater Toronto Area chiefs to ensure consistency. We worked very closely with our labor associations to ensure a safe workplace. But, you know, we've totally flipped our hygienic practices. We've totally flipped our approach to office space. We've totally flipped our approach to technology and the use of technology. We've been able to reduce, obviously, travel budgets. We've been able to do training very differently using a virtual world. And so in many ways, you know, I think that, you know, we can never lose sight that more than 100 citizens lost their life due to a health crisis. On the flip side of that, I think that as a community, we've, you know, recognized our resilience. But as a police service, we've also proved to ourselves that we can operate very differently. And it ties to your previous discussion, Iain, around economics, sustainability, doing business differently. And there's a lot of analogies and nexuses to both conversations. We can actually re-envision how we deliver services. We can reimagine that. I mean, we closed our divisions for 15 weeks. The world still continued to move forward. We still provided services. Now, you know, we've had a massive impact on the judicial system. The courts opened July 6th, but we also released and dealt with people that we come in contact with very differently. So we modernized in many different ways. And so as much as I'm sad to see the impact that the pandemic has had on our economy, on our unemployment rate, on families, and I feel for many of them because the organization I lead, we've continued to work. we continue to, not require government assistance and support. But out of this, I think will come many positives moving forward, which ties into the larger discussion of what does policing look like in the 21st century? And I think we can't lose sight of that, Iain.
Well, I wanted to take the opportunity to thank Bryan for joining us here on TrueNorthTV. It's been a great conversation. Bryan, thank you very much for making time.
A special thanks to you and your team for your community leadership, the incredible community partners making significant change. And I guess the one piece that I hope that when we leave this conversation is that we continue to work together. I think that there's a natural ability for the tech sector to join and integrate into public systems to drive the change that's required. So thanks for your leadership, Iain. Always much appreciated, and special thanks to your team for pulling this together.
Would love to have that conversation. We're actually working very, very closely with the hospitals in town through what's called the think tank, which is basically having them and the on-the-ground healthcare workers, doctors, physicians, administrators surface the challenges they're facing so that we can put those challenges out to the great innovators, entrepreneurs, and engineers in the Waterloo Region to solve them. We would love to do something similar with you. I wanted to thank Bryan, the unorthodox Chief of Police, who we see everywhere with huge commitment to this community, for joining us here today. I wanted to thank you for being with us today as well, and join us next Tuesday at noon for the next edition of True North TV. Thank you very much.
Thanks for watching this episode of True North TV. Subscribe to Communitech's YouTube channel to get notified of future episodes of True North TV.